Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Serafin, Executive Director of NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today on the podcast, we're going to focus on defense innovation, acquisition reform, and particularly how the Department of Defense identifies and addresses gaps in military capabilities. Specifically, we're going to discuss the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, better known as JCIDS. As threats continue to evolve and operational demands become more urgent, many are questioning whether this JCIDS process can effectively keep up. Joining us to discuss this is Bill Greenwalt, who's a well-known expert with extensive experience both at the Department of Defense and on Capitol Hill. Bill and his co-author Dan Patt recently wrote a notable report with the Hudson Institute called Required to Fail Beyond Documents, Accelerating Joint Advantage Through Direct Resourcing and Experimentation. It's a big title, but what it does is the report points out some flaws in the current requirement system, particularly the JCIDS process, talks about how that process has evolved over the years, and then it goes on to make some practical and tactical recommendations on how to make the system support the department better, especially as the department tries to move faster and deal with rapidly emerging technologies and threats. So, Bill, welcome to today's podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Arun. Great to be here.
So, Bill, you've been working in acquisition on the Hill and in executing acquisition programs in the Pentagon for a long time. I had the pleasure to work with you in two different runs on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And you've talked about personnel, you've talked about contracting. So now you're thinking about requirements. Why requirements?
Well, it's really a follow-on to a study that Dan Patt and I did several years ago called Competing in Time. And Required to Fail, which is a lot easier to refer to it like that than all that the subtitles, essentially focuses right in that. What we were looking at is how to change the total acquisition system. That's requirements, budget, contracting, acquisition systems, and then, frankly, operational testing and logistics and maintenance beyond that. How to focus that process on time. And so, as part of that original Competing in Time study, the JCIDS process took an inordinate amount of time, 2-3 years, plus the 2 to 3 years on the PPB process, plus a couple years to get on contract. And by the time you try to make a decision on doing anything, it was 7 or 8 years down the road. So we took a portion of that, and perhaps maybe we'll take other portions of the acquisition process in the future.
Because time has never been the priority for the department.
Time has not been a priority in the department since at least the early 1960s with the establishment of the PPB process. So during World War II, time was of essence and drove major change. And then during the Truman and Eisenhower administration, that legacy of World War II carried forward, and time was a matter. And decision time, what Dan and I call getting requirements, budget, and contracting, it took less than a year for all of those processes. And then to deliver something brand new and new capability that was operationally useful, that never been done before, was about 3 to 4 years. So a total process about 4 to 5 years.
Okay, and in a world where technology is moving so fast, threat is moving so fast, you would think time would be more important. You guys take aim in this report at one piece of the time challenge, which is the JCIDS process. So for the listeners, can you first just level set here? Can you describe what the JCIDS, Joint Capabilities and Integration Development System process is?
So in this linear way we buy and develop weapon systems, JCIDS is the joint validation of what it is we're considering pursuing, an idea or a capability or a technology, and moving forward. So it's the joint validation of it. That it takes from it, and there's an initial process before that, which is the service requirements process, which we should also we can definitely talk about here, and what it's designed to do based on a number of failures in the past is to bring together and the services requirements, ensure jointness, ensuring the interoperability, ensure that the combatant commanders have a voice in whatever is being developed. Try to focus innovation, on into the future, and provide some kind of strategic alignment over what the services are proposing.
When was it created?
It's evolved. JCIDS was 2003. Was the JCIDS, but there's an earlier iteration of it, the requirements generation system, and then what a number which basically evolved out of the Packard Commission, the JROC in 1986. So there's this evolution that has been playing out over the last 40 years.
And it's got pieces of it which are in regulation and pieces of it which are in law as well.
Yes.
Okay.
But primarily it's in regulation and practice.
So it all sounds, the things you said sound nice and good and noble. So it seems to have been created for some logical and good purpose. Go back to pre-2003, pre-80s. How was the department harmonizing those requirements between services? How was that playing out?
Primarily through budget allocation, primarily through decisions on which programs to fund, which programs to consider, done at the SecDef level or with the interface between OSD and the services. Very similar to what we kind of look at today with the DMAG, the Defense Management Advisory Group.
High-level decision
High-level decision making to make these ultimately these joint trade-offs.
So it was a lot of trades at senior leader rather than a process.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. That
Okay.
more of a political process and more of a
Right. So you have to create a process. You don't have to.
You don't have to create a process, but there has to be a coming together of the stakeholders somewhere.
So since that time, maybe since the first day, JCIDS has become a punching bag, and people blame it for stuff. And your report talks about the fact that things like joint urgent operational needs, JUONs, joint emergent operational needs, GONs, even stuff that we worked on the Hill, like middle tier of acquisition, all created to kind of get around the boundaries of the JCIDS process, right? I guess all to get after speed.
And so, absolutely, and that's one aspect of looking at this process. But the other is, what's the value add? And if JCIDS were providing these things, was providing jointness, was providing interoperability, was providing all these goodness that it tried to do, that would be great. It might take a long time, but the reality, it's not doing that. Plus, it's taking 3 years' time to essentially, it keeps the technology from moving in the department.
Right.
We have 3 years of lost time, and that's just a bad thing. So GONs and JUONs came about in the past war in Afghanistan and Iraq. The counter IED programs, the NRAP programs were all designed we had to go faster. There had to be a sense of urgency, almost a World War II-like type of thing. And the requirements process wasn't working, and these processes were created to go around it.
Right.
And then you mentioned when we worked together in 2017, 2016, reforming the acquisition system, MTAs were designed to be a time-based acquisition system. A time to essentially, can we operational prototype something like we did in many of these early 1950s programs, or operation field something like we did in NRAP in a short period of time. And when we created MTAs, it was basically JCIDS didn't apply.
Okay, having said all that,
Yes.
I'm going to give you a chance to say something nice about the JCIDS process. Something good must have come from this. We do have a very effective operational force. What is the JCIDS process good at?
Unfortunately, nothing. Essentially, we have good operational capabilities, and we have systems that may have taken a little bit too long or a lot longer than they should, and they work, and that's a good thing. But it was nothing that the JCIDS process actually led to. As a matter of fact, it just added more time to get there. And again,
so it's almost like we got these things despite.
We got these things despite, and a lot of it was done because senior officials and junior officials and congressional staffers got together and drove something around the system to make it work.
Yeah, when you look at when the system worked, and we've written some stuff on this, when you look at examples like Operation Warp Speed, mm-hmm. or MRAP, like you mentioned, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, one of the things that comes out commonly is senior leaders take over and short-circuit the traditional process.
Yeah. And so that's an indictment of the system. So when that happens, why should we have the system? We should do something else and focus on a different criteria, not process, not validation, but something different, and that's what we come up with later.
Okay, I'm going to try to defend the process.
Okay, all right.
I come from an S&T community. You've always held that against me.
I have, but it's okay. We'll
Those people will come up with lots of clever ideas, which aren't backed by a real operational need or requirement. Doesn't a JCIDS process put some discipline on the system to not just chase shiny objects?
No, because you have to actually see those shiny objects actually either perform or not perform, and therefore you need to and if those are just pie in the sky type, it won't take long to determine that it doesn't work, and so something has to replace it versus an idea that perhaps we might get there. We need to get something tangible in the hands of the warfighter and test it, and that's the criteria behind what we were doing 10 years ago in acquisition reform, and frankly what this paper essentially will recommend.
So basically it's a process that takes identification of threats and capabilities, puts them through some machinery, produces a formal requirement, which then creates money through the PPBE process,
yes,
which then creates actual programs and contracts and work being done.
That is ultimately how our system works today.
Okay.
And I will argue that is not the way the system should work if we are competing against an advanced near peer or peer adversary,
right,
that is actually going faster and doing rapid prototyping and moving things out on a,
right.
in
or
a different
if
speed.
Commercial innovation is just popping things up globally, that might be national security threats or national security opportunities.
And that's the most interesting thing about who has the best time-based innovation system today. It's Silicon Valley.
Right.
And why is that? Well, because they may have borrowed DoD's time-based innovation system from the 1950s. So yeah, I would say that process has imposed upon us in so many different ways that has taken us away from the disruptive type of innovation, or even the sustaining type of innovations we were doing quickly at a different time, and what Silicon Valley has been doing for the last 50 years.
Okay, so now think back on your time in the building and on the Hill. This is a big process going on. It's a theory affecting the spending of a lot of money. How, in your roles, you were Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Policy, you were lead staffer on the Senate Armed Services Committee on acquisition issues. How did you interact with the JCIDS process?
Not very much. There was the only thing I saw the JCIDS process as being a speed bump in the pathway of getting things done. And so if you you give after 3 years or so, you can get through your speed bump, you could potentially get something done. Again, when no one's chasing us, we can take all the time we want. We can have so many processes. We can validate things until the cows come home. But the world has changed, and we have to go fast. And so going fast means taking those processes and streamlining them, getting rid of what doesn't work, and moving on to something does. We still need to make a determination what's needed. Well, for many things, we should look to the combatant commander. For others, we should be looking at what's the state of technology. And high-level decision-making could, whether in a DMAG or something else, could make some of those decisions to allocate resource. But it'll be the resource allocation process handed over to the acquirers, not a process that validates that somehow the jointness and interoperability somehow will come out of this project.
So the report does a good job of breaking down how the process is supposed to work and how it actually does work. I found one of the parts of it really fascinating. It mentions that you and Dan Pat conducted a quantitative analysis of different JCIDS related documents, including something called the JCIDS manual, which is apparently more than 400 pages long and is classically the kind of thing that you have to create to scale up a process. You have to create a bureaucracy and roles and duties and that sort of thing. But this 400-page long manual, you found that 40% of the content focuses on the production and formatting of documents. You say another quarter of it focuses on specifying system-level performance attributes and metrics and parameters. And then, interestingly, shockingly, I guess, only 6% of it actually touches on joint operational concepts or threats. So, a couple of questions then. I'm under the impression that all of these requirements kinds of things are heavily classified documents. So how are you even able to do this kind of research?
Well, thankfully, the JCIDS manual is not. And so therefore we could do a cluster analysis. We could do run the AI programs on it to pull out the words and make that analysis. But yes, this is what makes this a very hard process to look at from an academic perspective, because so much is classified. And so you can talk about it at a high level, and you can do those type of analysis, and then talk to people who are essentially frustrated with the inability of this process to deliver on its. Starting with General Cartwright, who 15 years ago said blow the system up, and unfortunately he didn't succeed in doing that.
Second question is, based on what you found, what do you think led to the fact that so little of it, the manual is focused on actual content? Why is so much of it focused on process?
I think we can ask the same question about the PPBE process. We can ask the same question about the 5,000 major capability development process. The department, when it doesn't have a sense of urgency, essentially defaults to process and PowerPoint slides and formatting of text. It
creates work for people.
It creates work for lots of people who essentially we could put them into better use. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Do you have an estimate how much it costs to run a JCIDS process year over year?
I'm afraid to take that.
Okay.
But I would say there are thousands of people working this.
Contractors and government.
Contractors and government, and we can put a number on that if we wanted to, but it's a lot.
So there's a lot of great analysis of the existing process and the history behind it in the report. But you guys, as is your style, try to fix the world's problems here. And maybe one of the biggest takeaways from the report is your recommendation to propose a completely alternative process, which you call the Joint Operational Acceleration Pathway. So it's still a 4-letter acronym. Tell me why this one is so much better.
And I'm sorry we made an acronym. I think but we are communicating with the Joint Staff, so we had to
That's
try
what
to.
they speak in.
That's what they speak in. We figured we would be helpful in that regard. Essentially, we create a kind of a two-part mechanism, but the pathway is really designed to encourage experimentation, to encourage combatant commander involvement. It's there to essentially bring technology and solutions to the warfighter, have them use it, and then determine whether we should take the next step. And so it's a very hands-on type of process versus basically a process where you get a validated JROCM or whatever, and then it sits on a shelf. In other words, we're going now today and saying if there's something we need to look at, let's get it out there. Let's get a contractor working on it. Let's move it out to the field. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, kill it, and we move on to something else.
And so then this pathway then has a bunch of different elements and slightly different roles for the different players,
Yes.
whether they're the combatant commanders or the acquisition people or the OSD staff,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Okay, and in the report, you talk about sort of mechanisms by which you run this pathway.
Yes.
And one of them is called mission engineering and integration activity, which as I understand it is it's an activity that runs short cycle experiments, like you just mentioned. Mm-hmm. It intended to address specific operational challenges that are identified by COCOMs. In the old days, this is a little bit like what they used to call advanced capability technology demonstrations and joint capability technology demonstrations.
You're right there. You're right there.
So pretend you are a company, you have a piece of gear, and you want to show it to DoD, right? How does this process then help you get your foot in the door any better? Is it better than JCIDs or less?
To me, it's very similar to how the venture capital community works. So in other words, lots of companies with great ideas, some of them no more than a piece of paper, some of them a little more advanced, get their pitch deck out and shop it around. And a venture capitalist, or a group of them, decides, yeah, I want to fund that. And so that's the first step. So basically the first step is almost a Series A type limited funding to build up some type of experimentation with this new concept. So essentially we're trying to take the joint staff and make them venture capitalists, okay? And who's going to be the ultimate driver of the needs and who's even the ultimate grader of the homework? Be the combatant commanders. And so MIA essentially is what the remnant of the former joint staff that's doing JCIDs. They're going to become the venture capitalists of the Department of Defense, and they're going to see those pitch decks. They're going to see those ideas, and then they're going to hear from what the command commander is asking them to do. So the investors, essentially, what I want to put my money into, what we should put our money into, and then experiment, and then we go to the next phase.
So the experiments then are the sort of, we could call them demos or rodeos, right? Chances for companies to show off their gear to this kind of investor board built from COCOM and joint staff type people. And I suppose informed by what they understand are operational needs today and into the future.
Right.
Okay. So those experiments then, do you feel like they should be constantly running?
Absolutely. Constantly running. And because technology, as we're seeing, whether it's software changes or, based on current conflicts in the world, are moving in a matter of weeks and days. And so therefore we should be experimenting in a matter of weeks and days. So, that means lots and lots of white papers to start the process, OTA or CSO type acquisition methods, getting these things out into the field, into Indo-PACOM, and having these tests and experimentations, and then determinations whether they need to go forward.
So that's, we've had this discussion when we talk about agile software development and DevSecOps and connecting users with developers and all I can think of is that's a lot of people and a lot of time.
Yes.
And so it sounds like this is a very people-centric process, and it sounds like it's going to use up a lot of government staff and contractor staff. Is that right?
I would argue that right now the JCIDS process eats up thousands and thousands of contractor and
Government.
some of the most senior government officers. Let's get them to work on something
Without actually getting their hands on technology.
Yeah, without ever getting on hands on technology. Exactly. Let's get them out in the field. Let's get their hands on technology. And I would bet that it's going to take fewer people to do this than it will to operate the entire JCIDS process.
Do you think?
And let alone we can talk about the services requirements process.
Right.
Which
So I'm going to get there.
Okay.
But first I want to say, okay, now let me think about this. If I'm a company that has a cool technology, but it doesn't meet an identified gap that I've become aware of, does this process, you think, become more accepted? It's an easier path for me to get a technology push into the system?
I would hope so. And again, if the culture changes, if the mindset changes of the military and the commanders that, yeah, we're like venture capitalists. We can drive technology change. We can see what's out there and invest in it and see if it works. And oh, by the way, we have to understand and get our arms around the culture that, oh, maybe 6 to 7 of those out of 10 are going to fail. And that's okay.
Okay, so it's a combination of, hey, we've got these joint capability gaps, bring us stuff, and just bring us stuff, and we'll take a look at it.
That's the next level.
In SBIR speak, Small Business Innovation Research speak,
Yes.
it's like focus topic versus open topic, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
But I also think that something else is needed, and in this process, in the sense that, we have a lot of things of what our gaps are, and we think about that, and we think about where the technology may or may not go, but to fill those gaps. But we need a cell of individuals who essentially their sole ideas in life is how to disrupt the current system.
Right.
And so they also need to be calling.
And they need to be technically astute and operationally aware.
Exactly.
Both, right?
Both. And so essentially, you not only do we want to disrupt our adversaries, we want to disrupt ourselves.
Right.
Because it would much better to disrupt ourselves first than have our adversaries surprise us in their disruption.
Right.
So we need to be focusing more and more on that. So that may not be a capability gap that the commander is thinking about.
Okay.
Someone else has to think about that.
Okay, now, the current system does not put a lot of faith in the ability of the COCOMs, the combatant commanders, to make technical assessments.
Yeah.
Right? We used to say, I'll pay the first contractor who said, I flew to Indo-PACOM, I showed them my thing, and they didn't want it. Right? No one ever comes back from Indo-PACOM saying that.
Yeah. So
where are the COCOMs going to get the kind of technical expertise to do this kind of work?
Through the MIA, in other words, that organization needs to bring those technical chops, and also be asking the right questions. But the issue is, it's not just, oh, show me your stuff, it looks great. No, it has to be, the commander has to actually use that.
Yeah.
In other words, this has to be
operational. There's still be rigor.
There has to be rigor in the system.
Right.
But then this next level is, this is one small experimentation. There may be a follow-on experimentation. Then there may actually be the need to create an MTA or
some kind of program.
Some more formal. But it's a step-by-step process. But if we need something that frankly works, is valid, I want to make careful I'm saying validated, because I want to be validated requirement, but validated in the fact that it will work operationally.
Right.
And then there's a decision made
it's
that
minimally viable.
Through the resource, a minimal viable product. Yeah. Through the resourcing process, that we should actually fund this to the next level.
And we have concepts like that, right? Minimum objective requirements and threshold requirements. We already have sort of these kinds of concepts.
But I would take a lot of that and come up with a new framework of thinking, because the issue here is we need to be looking at how a Silicon Valley company or how we would have originally done this and say, this works, this is something we can do, we can scale up and again, time is of essence here.
Right.
So it's something we can do in 12 months, something we do in 6 months, something we do in 24 months.
Okay, now the other piece is, in the end, it's not the COCOMs or the joint staff that procures and sustains.
That's right.
Or trains people to use this stuff. It's the services.
Yes.
So tell me why the service requirements process is not handled.
Well, I'll tell you. Well, let's actually go to the JAR here. Maybe that can because there has to be incentive for the service to want to do this.
What's the JAR?
The JAR is the Joint Acceleration Reserve. So that's the second piece of the overarching pathway. You have this organization that's out there experimenting, and then you have this budgetary framework.
The money part.
The money part.
Okay.
And the money part is and what we're trying to do here is to incentivize the services to want to take some of these successful experiments and bring it into their budget. And so how do you do that? Well, if you tell them to take it out of HIDE, it's not going to happen. Now, so what we propose here is essentially a pre-budgetary holdback. And essentially take a portion of the budget, almost like SBIR. How about that? And essentially have it there. And when some of these things go, then the services who is most capable of carrying through this experimentation to the next level will have an initial piece of a budgetary.
So even if they don't have it in their plan, this money is held back as a reserve by the Secretary of Defense, let's say.
Let's say, yeah.
And then allocated to those projects which are endorsed by this COCOM-led experimentation process.
Exactly.
But it shows up in the budget request as not as a sort of reserve fund.
Right.
It shows up as legitimately funding projects so that the appropriations committees know what the money's for.
The appropriations committee will know what the money is for. It's for these type of follow-on capabilities. They may not know exactly which ones are going to be, but if I was an appropriations staffer, I would basically during the year I'd want to know which ones are where the money's moving and how successful it is.
Right. And you were in appropriations.
I wasn't appropriate, but it was mostly an oversight. So don't.
So the appropriators, I guess, would a little bit have to change their oversight mechanisms.
They would have to essentially be more open to a pot of money that is not strictly targeted to something 3 years ahead of time. All right. And so, I mean, that's a mindset the appropriators need to get out of as well.
But in theory, the department can make a case based on actual experimentation and endorsement by the COCOMs.
That's right.
Which, again, is something the appropriators routinely do when they use the unfunded lists of the COCOMs to fund things.
And I would argue that these are better than the unfunded list because you've actually experimented and have real capability that you can justify spending that next level of money through the JAR.
Right. So back to the services.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Again, eventually this has to go to the services. One of the things that Dan has harped on over the years is the lack of jointness in some of the service programs and resulting capabilities. How does this process then help the jointness piece of it?
The way I would look at this is that the services are going to continue to do what they do, and the issue for joint warfighting is how can you deal with the seams between the services and the services capabilities and so on. A lot of that's going to be software. A lot of that's going to be how that communications and so on. And those are the type of projects that can be funded through and experimented and developed through this other mechanism. So I mean, it's going to be extremely difficult, and it has been, to keep the Navy from saying no, I don't want aircraft carriers tomorrow, or the Air Force, I don't want a manned jet fighter. Okay, but regardless, those major decisions are not being made in JCIDs. They're being made, if they are being made, at a higher level in the DMAG or something like that.
Right.
And so and through the resourcing process,
Right.
whether the Department of Defense. So this is a budget issue. This is a CAPE issue. This is not a joint
and it's
requirement.
interesting, the thousands of people and I guess hundreds of millions of dollars in multiple months, potentially years, that is this JCIDS process then can be overcome by senior leader attention to create more jointness and more speed. But that in and of itself requires a huge amount of staffing and high-level meetings.
Yes.
So even to override the process has to have its own process,
Yeah.
right? And that's the kind of world that you're trying to get us out of.
And at least get established a world in which there's real data and real capabilities out there to make a decision based on rather than a piece of paper.
Okay, so now pretend we're in this future where this is happening. Tell me about the impacts on the industry side, on the contractors, on the executors of R&D programs, procurement programs, sustainers, those kinds of people. So what's the impact on the big guys, let's say?
So the big guys will have, opportunities in this new world. They also have opportunities. They know how to work the service requirements process, and frankly, they know how to work the JCIDS process. So essentially, for them, they will adapt to whatever rules of the game that the Department of Defense comes up with. The more interesting focus is what about the new non-traditional world, or the new commercial companies, or the new emerging defense unique companies who are trying to break in. And here, I think the opportunities will be much greater.
Because there'll be these opportunities to demonstrate.
Absolutely,
right?
because versus having to compete based on a concept, you can compete based on something real.
Right. Okay, the other class of people we think about a lot here at ETI is the investor community,
Yes.
whether it's all the private capital people, private equity, venture capital, even banks that make loans, the big guys spending their IRAD money, all non-DoD appropriated dollars, right? Does this process help them understand their investment opportunities and make potentially more investments?
I think it could be helpful. One, I think they will understand the system is very similar to would be similar to this new system. This
More recognizable.
More recognizable. And also, if they can invest up front in a capability that they can bring right to the warfighter and be validated and move on, by having a jar there, by having this capability fund, they could actually get funded a lot faster in year of execution.
The speed of return.
The speed of return becomes much greater if they're successful. So they could definitely make their own investments, and we've seen a lot of these companies make their own investments. But then they have a pathway in which to bring it forward, but not just to sit there and die on the vine and wait to get it in the palm process. That, oh yeah, the commander thinks it's great, but wait for 3 years for PPP to kick in. Here's a transition of capability, a reserve to fund their system right away.
Okay, and then the other side of that, the requirements piece of it, which is, like we talked about earlier, heavily classified and 5,000 pages of manual to create these documents, which makes it difficult for someone on the outside to understand what's going on, whether you're an investor or non-traditional. Are you creating a process which is more transparent? In addition to being faster,
yeah.
Does it also describe the market in a different way?
I think it changes the market, yeah. And hopefully what it does is it focuses on capabilities that we can actually create today versus discussions about whether 503 miles per hour is better than 498, and then that drives us to engineer those capabilities, which we should not be thinking. We should be, well, what can we actually do?
Right.
And that's a different mindset and a different way to invest your money.
And again, it's more akin to what they're used to.
More akin, yeah, absolutely, because it's minimal viable product, and then serial iterative operational prototypes is how Silicon Valley has been working for the last decade.
But you're not
Several
explicitly calling for more declassification of any of this.
No.
More showing of what's needed. That's not what you're talking about.
No. The issue is transparency will come in whether these things work or not. And in the white papers, the call for the white papers, the calls for the capability, the calls for the experimentation, some of those will be classified, many of them will not be.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask you to put on one of your old hats. You have many old hats to sift through.
Well, yeah, what hat should I put on today?
I'm going to ask you to put on authorization staffer, professional staff member, Bill Greenwalt. In either of your 2 runs on the Hill, what would you do now, having received this Hudson document?
So I would have first, since unfortunately I had been part of the reforms 10 years ago, where we tried to reform JCIDs.
It's the 10th year anniversary of us completely fixing the system.
Completely fixing the system, absolutely. And I would say that what we tried to do by empowering the services, by empowering JCIDs to focus on proactive type requirements, didn't work. And so I would essentially look at it and say, it's time to take the one piece of legislation that outlines this and just delete it. And that'd be Section 181 of Title 10.
That's the section that controls the JCIDS process?
And then the JROC process.
And the Joint Requirements Oversight.
You could probably be surgical and essentially leave the JROC in place if you see some value in that. And I think I would go to the department and see, well, what would JROC actually, what function would it perform in the absence of JCIDs?
Right.
And I think it could form a higher level.
So you would delete the whole legislative requirement?
I would.
And do you think the department would then disassemble the process?
The department doesn't have to. You could be a little more prescriptive if you wanted to and establish.
No funds shall be used to run a process.
You could do that. The discussions we've had, there just seems to be a lot of interest in coming up with a process that actually works. And so I think the department, if provided the right incentives, and I think this time, perhaps this is a better time than it was 10 years ago.
New administration coming in, ideas coming off of the Hill. This might be a moment.
This might be a moment to actually provide the incentives. So basically, by repealing any of the references to JCIDs in statute, I think you could achieve some of the objectives here.
I would say on the Hill, there's always been a cultural reluctance to go after the requirements process. And I guess I would argue it's because it was controlled by people in uniform.
Yeah.
Do you think that there should be that reluctance, or you're just kind of viewing it as a part of the process and it needs reform and oversight just like every other part of the process?
I mean, it is. And if you remember, we tried to empower the service chiefs. We tried to, we tried to reform this 10 years ago. And I think after 30 years of reform, it's just time to say, this one process isn't adding value, and let's get rid of it, and then let's focus on some of the other processes like the military requirements process, like PPBE, and try to get them to be focused on a time-based manner.
Okay, last question. The report came out a few months ago now. What's been the reception in Congress and in the Pentagon to it? What do you think? Is it taking root?
I think there's a lot of interest. I think there is a lot of discussion going on, and that's one of the things that Dan and I did with Competing in Time, and we try to do with Required to Fail, is to start a debate. I think that debate's happening. I think it's happening on the Hill. I think it's happening within the building, and reform efforts, as you know, either take time or sometimes they move really fast, and I think talking about the right things and having the right questions is good for the system, and I think that's the real benefit of this report. There's a lot in here. I mean, it's a long report. There are a lot of different anecdotes and recommendations and so on. But the idea is, let's have a debate. Does this system have any value? And if the people who think it does, let's have a debate. But if it doesn't, let's get rid of it. We can't afford excess time. We can't afford processes that don't add value, and that because we need to focus on other processes that could add value, or frankly, need to be just as scrutinized as the JCIDS process.
That's great. Bill Greenwalt is Senior Fellow at AEI and also co-author of the new report by the Hudson Institute with Dan Patt called Required to Fail. The report's available on Hudson's website. We'll drop a link into the text box so everyone can find it. And we look forward to that long conversation on how to actually reform the process. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Thanks, Arun. I appreciate it.
Visit ETI's website to sign up for our mailing list and register for our various webinars, events, and educational offerings, including our Tech 101 series. Visit our YouTube channel, that's at Emerging Tech ETI, to see all of our past podcasts, webinars, and other content. You can also find our podcast on all your podcast platforms. We are excited to announce that the website for the third NDIA Emerging Technologies for Defense Conference and Exhibition, which is going to be held August 27th to 29th at the DC Convention Center, is now up. The website's at www.ndiatechexpo.org. For the conference, we're working with a number of organizations in the Department of Defense, including OSD, the CDAO, Chief Digital and AI Officer, the Military Services, UCOM, AFRICOM, and other COCOMs, and we're putting together keynote sessions, breakout panels, technical presentations that'll all allow you to see the latest administration initiatives and partnership opportunities and share your great technical innovations that are shaping the future of defense. Probably a lot of conversation on reforming the system like what Bill's been talking about today. At the conference, we're also working on a hackathon, an exhibit floor, networking receptions, government industry one-on-one interchange meetings, speed dating meetings, and much more, all of which will make the event something that shouldn't be missed. Agenda and registration information will be coming soon again to www.ndiatechexpo.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to like our episodes and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of our latest content. A special thank you to Melanie Yu and Daniel Park for producing this episode. Thanks so much for tuning into Emerging Tech Horizons.